So I'd like to start off by welcoming you today to the Idle Jorg and to the Jett Memorial Lecture this afternoon. To give you a little bit of background, Jett was our public programs manager from 1999 until 2007, when he was taken from us at a much too young age. In his 8 years at the Idle Jorg, Leon made his mark on the museum through his dedication to quality programming and to working within the Indianapolis community to ensure that anyone coming to the museum could see themselves in the museum, in the stories, in the art and exhibitions, and in the programming. In keeping with Leon's personal and professional mission, we instituted this annual memorial lecture to highlight the contributions of the all too often unknown stories of historical and contemporary African Americans in the West. Today's talk is Moving Toward Freedom, the Process of Black Emancipation. Dr. Modupe Labode, Assistant Professor of History and Museum Studies, Public Scholar of African American History and Museums, and Adjunct Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at IUPUI, will give us a historical overview of the process of emancipation with particular emphasis on the Indiana experience. She will be followed by Faye Williams, a native of Galveston, Texas, who will relate her family's stories as word of emancipation made it to Texas in 1865. Faye Williams, a member of the Indiana African American Genealogy Group, has been an attorney in private practice in Indianapolis since 1971. Over the years, she has done extensive research about the slave trade, the emancipation process, and the continuing struggle for ultimate full citizenship and equality. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Labode.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And I'd also like to thank Martha Hill and Tamara Winfrey Harris, who are not here right now, but for arranging this. And again, the Indiana African American Genealogy Group for hosting this. There are more people here than I had actually hoped for, so I really appreciate your coming out today on this day that just seems made for having, staying inside. The Idle Jorg is generously taping this or recording this, so I will not move around is my want because the camera is right here. So today, Ms. Williams and I have the privilege of dividing the discussion, and I'm actually going to be focusing on something that we don't really talk about that often in mixed public, and that is celebrations of emancipation, how the emancipation, the end of slavery has been commemorated or not. And this is an image from Richmond, Virginia. It's a celebration in 1890. It's a Thanksgiving celebration going over several days. And Virginia, for whatever reason, I think largely because they must have had a lot of money going toward digitization, there are lots of images of emancipation celebrations in Virginia that are available about the web. And I'll be making available some of the links that I looked at just to see these. But some of the questions that I'd like to consider as we go through this is who celebrated emancipation? How have people celebrated emancipation over the years? When did they do it? Where did they do it? And of course, what were they celebrating? Because oftentimes the celebrations have been more complex. There was more going on in a celebration than what we immediately think. And this also made me think just more generally about holidays, what we do when we celebrate our various holidays. And if you have celebrated emancipation, you can think what you were doing when you were doing that. Was it a family holiday? Was it a community holiday? And if you haven't celebrated emancipation, think about that, why that wasn't an issue. I'm going to be throwing a few dates and terms at you. Students know that I'm a historian that doesn't really like dates and that well, but I'm just think about it as reference, before or after, because I'm always looking up dates. But some of the things that I just want to kind of get clear is that emancipation is actually a legal term. And I'll be using it in both the legal way and also in the more kind of common way that people did. And emancipation is when a state intervenes to free an enslaved person. So it's a state action. That's different than manumission, when an enslaver, somebody who owns another human being, frees that human being. And it's different than abolition, and that is when a state or a political entity completely ends the ownership of other human beings. In the United States, we had the experience of both gradual emancipation and immediate emancipation. So gradual emancipation is that it, as the term indicates, it takes place over a time period. It's a phase out. So many of the states, the colonies of the states of the North had, they ended slavery in a gradual emancipation manner. Immediate emancipation was always kind of, I think, what enslaved people wanted. Slave owners, human owners, were very reluctant to have immediate emancipation. They wanted it to be phased out. Ultimately, the United States ended up abolishing slavery. And one thing just to keep in mind is throughout all this is that people who were enslaved always acted to free themselves. I think when you look at, there's some wonderful databases of runaway slaves, and one of the things that people were always saying is, I don't understand why this person is running away. I don't understand why they're leaving. And usually people who were enslaved weren't necessarily happy with the fact that they were not free. I advanced a little bit earlier here, but one of the things I want to quote is from a historian, Manisha Sinha, who is at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And what she says about emancipation, I think, is useful to keep in mind, that it's a complicated process and that it involves many actors, including the enslaved person itself. Because a lot of times we tend to use a shorthand that tends to get hardened in people's minds, that it was the state of New Jersey or Abraham Lincoln that enacted emancipation. It was a very complicated process, often a political process as well. So this image that I have here, it might be difficult to read a lot of it, but one of the things that just, what I like about this map is that it reveals is that this is the former colonies of the original 13 colonies that made up the United States. And as you can see, there were people who were both free and enslaved in all of the colonies. So people might not think about Massachusetts or New York or Pennsylvania about being sites of slavery, but there's no doubt that they were. And the major cities that you see here in this, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, those are going to be the main areas that we have evidence in the early periods of celebrations of emancipation. So when I was thinking about, when you were thinking about where does emancipation celebrations occur, there were lots of free people in towns like Charleston and Savannah, but it was much harder to celebrate freedom when you're in the heart of a colony and then a state that is dedicated to keeping people enslaved. So I would like to, this is very wordy. And all you need to know is that it's Article 1, Section 9 of the US Constitution, and that's the Enumerated Powers Act. So I'm not going to presume to take Ms. Williams, Esquire, the lawyer, to interpret this, but this is the indication where we first see some celebrations of freedom. So in the very first article of Section 9 is what I have in boldface, is that in that real legalese, what it's basically saying is that Congress could not act to end the slave trade until 1808. It did not guarantee that the slave trade would be ended at 1808. It required the Congress to wait until 1808 to end the slave trade. Eventually, that's what the Congress did through lots of wrangling. But the formal end of the slave trade, and I say formal because the informal slave trade continued, and we'll be hearing more about that. But on January 1st, 1808 is when you see the first evidences of celebrations of freedom. These were largely organized by free people of color, free African Americans in the North. For historians, it's very exciting because this is when you also see a lot of written pamphlets generated talking about what the end of the slave trade means. And it's really striking that almost all the African Americans that are writing saying, we're hoping this is the first step in the end of slavery. And this is long before there's a lot of organized abolitionists or white abolitionists in the United States. But African Americans were saying, we want to be free, we want to have slavery ended. The evidence is that they took place in the largest cities where free African Americans lived, and they often involved some things that still exist today, prayer. They took place in churches, and that's largely because churches were sites in the public area in cities that were controlled by African Americans. Many African Americans historically have experienced difficulty of what you might call freedom of the streets. That is the ability to move unmolested through public space, the ability to move without being harassed, shot, made fun of, etc. We can talk about that much later, but it is something. But many times it meant that that celebrations for African Americans often took place in private places that they felt safe, that they could own. So there's lots of speeches, there's lots of prayers. Much late, and around the 1830s, you start seeing parades. But those were relatively difficult to organize because in a lot of communities, African Americans would be targeted if there were parades. So Boston was notorious for having white people basically like throw rotten vegetables, throw rocks at African Americans who were in a parade or a procession. So that's why a lot of times it was in a private space. This is just an example of one of the abolition of the slave trade and an oration from Faye Williams. It's published I think in Philadelphia, I think. And so there's these really nice, for people who love history, like these are just very exciting. A lot of the topics that these orations we're looking at saying thanking God for having the end of slavery, very much making a connection with both Africa and other enslaved people. So it's the connection of the African diaspora. So not necessarily saying Africa was back then, but making connections and wanting Africa, also the continent, not to be affected by the slave trade. So those celebrations lasted for about 20 years, and they certainly, and it was usually around the beginning of around New Year. And one thing I should say is that New Year's in the early America was a much bigger deal than Christmas. So New Year was a time of carousing, it was a time for drinking. If you were religious, it was a time to go to church. So what African Americans were doing was having their separate kind of solemn ceremony as opposed to carousing and doing crazy things on New Year's. Around the 1830s, however, African Americans and abolitionists began looking in two directions for inspiration. One was directly across the Atlantic to Great Britain, which was having a bigger abolitionist movement, which is really complicated and exciting. And then also to the Caribbean, where there were just numerous uprisings of enslaved people, people organizing, making it very clear that they wanted slavery to end. But before going too much into that, what I want to note is that there were some celebrations that were not publicly noted. And this is the man, Toussaint Louverture, I apologize for my French. He was the leader, as you can see here in this wonderful print with his sword drawn and on a horse, the leader of the revolt in Haiti, the rebellion, the revolution that began in the 1790s and ended with Haiti declaring itself the first free black republic in 1804. African Americans in the United States were extremely aware of this. Enslaved people were aware of this. Slave owners were aware of this and terrified. Cities like New Orleans and Baltimore and Charleston were just filled with so-called refugees, former slave owners in Haiti coming to the United States, telling the slave owners just how horrendous slaves could be when they rose up against their owners. So any commemoration and marking of the Haitian Revolution was usually done in private. The US government and US and slave owners often made a huge effort not to let that commemoration happen. So in some ways you could say this is the, like for Sherlock Holmes, this is the dog that didn't bark. This is the biggest revolution happening in this hemisphere, and it is not being commemorated. It goes really underground. What does get commemorated initially, after a little bit, is the long process of emancipation in the British Caribbean. And in August 1st, 1833, this is the formal ending of slavery in the United Kingdom, in the British Empire. So the formal endings of slavery, obviously in the Caribbean, parts of South America, South Africa, parts of India. Some of those images, you can see the kneeling slave. That is an image that comes from the British abolitionist movement. The person saying, in this case, a woman, this was the women's abolitionist one, am I not a woman and a sister? Am I not a man and a brother? For those of you who like fine porcelain, Josiah Wedgwood actually sold abolitionist plates that you can get in Wedgwood blue, I mean they cost a mint now, about saying, am I not a man and a brother? This really kind of, something you're not gonna see the equivalent of in the United States. However, after there was not an immediate end to unfree labor. The British colonies went through a long, brutal period called the Apprenticeship, in which formerly enslaved people had to work a number of hours, I think it was 40.5 hours, for their enslavers. They were subject to brutal punishment. This is the treadmill that you see over there, that it was, that for any violation, there would be sentence to treadmill. This is an abolitionist picture. You see a woman being whipped on the far left, people impoverished. So there was a great deal of activism to actually end slavery. August 1st, 1838, the apprenticeship ends. And almost immediately, in 1838, you start seeing celebrations of the end of slavery in the United States, too. So just kind of think about it. Think about what that means for people in the United States to be celebrating the end of slavery in another country. Some people definitely saw that as treasonous. The United States was, I think it might be the only major slave power that was divided. If you were in Brazil, slavery was legal all over Brazil. If you were in Cuba, slavery was legal all over Cuba. The United States had a division, and free African Americans definitely took advantage of that. So in the North, you have celebrations of emancipation around August 1st. Usually it's on August 1st. And for some people who are church people, your churches, especially in the kind of South, have homecoming celebrations. My grandmother's church did in August 1st. They had those August 1st celebrations right in Virginia, right from the end of slavery. And some people think that it was a commemoration of this end, that August 1st became an important date for African Americans because of the end of slavery in the West Indies. Here's another example of how the August celebrations would be used. You probably can't read that, but this is from an Ohio newspaper, and it's basically saying we African Americans and whites are starting an abolition society. So this is in the 1840s, and they're saying we want slavery to end now. We're tired of Southerners pushing their laws at us. So the abolition of slavery and the August holidays start taking both a political as well as a summer holiday aspect. This is one from Framingham, Massachusetts. This is where radical abolitionists were organized. And when I say radical, they thought the Constitution should be, the Constitution didn't have any merit because it permitted slavery. It was a slave document. So this was in Massachusetts. And some of you might be aware of that Frederick Douglass had a very kind of really amazing oration, said, what is to the slave the 4th of July? And basically what he's saying is freedom doesn't really exist as long as slavery exists. So you start having these August holidays that were emerging. This is an image of so-called Contraband of War. So we've kind of really gone fast forward. Contraband of War is a war term, meaning property that belonged to the enemy. And in the case of in the beginning of the Civil War, that meant human property. So these are human beings, formerly enslaved people, freeing themselves, following the Union Army, going across the Rappahannock River in Virginia. And so you have these oxen. I'll send you the Library of Congress picture because it's just a gorgeous picture. You can just see the expressions on people's faces as they've got this really tenuously, they've got these oxen and there's just people in the middle of this pretty large river. And I just wanted to have this up there is because the end, as you all know, is that the beginning of the Civil War, the declaration of the Civil War, did not mean that slavery was ending. But for many people who were enslaved, once they saw the Union Army in their area, they decided to follow them. The Union Army didn't always treat them very well. They were often very vulnerable to abuse. They were put to work. But this was a way in which people tried to emancipate themselves. I just want to go through a few dates here that also become important for the Emancipation holidays. One of them is April 16th, 1862. This is when Abraham Lincoln authorized the end of slavery within the District of Columbia. So if this is probably a later image, but just the way that people are dressed and the kind of wealth that's on display, this is not a Civil War image. But this is a time period, the way slavery ended in Washington, D.C. is kind of unusual, that those slave owners who supported the Union could petition to get $300 from the government for every enslaved person that they freed. Emancipated people, former slaves, were given the chance to go to Liberia if they wanted to. Not that many did, but that's another issue altogether. But if you are from the District of Columbia, you know that people in Washington take this day extremely seriously. For the rest of us who are not in the district, it comes up every few years when tax day falls on this day. So I think about 2 years ago, the taxes were due on, the Monday was April 16th, and we got an extra day, I think it was April 17th, and that's because it's a public holiday in Washington, D.C. They do not, everything closes, Emancipation Day is still recognized in the district. Another day that has since been proclaimed been recognized is September 22nd, 1862, and this is the day that President Lincoln authorized the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This is when he's saying, in January 1st next year, this is going to be what's going to be taking place. So that public announcement became marked. And then also January 1st, 1863, which is the formal marking of the Declaration of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation only took effect into areas that were now under insurrections in the Confederate States. But let's just say very few slave owners said, oh, yes, now we're going to free our enslaved people. But it laid important legal framework. And one of the things that it also did was the authorization of African American men to become soldiers and sailors in the Union troops. And this is just a wonderful print from Harper's. And so the US colored troops become really important in almost all emancipation celebrations. So you get this fusion of military and emancipation. So what I'm going to do now, though, is just kind of show you some images related to the end that after the Civil War, after 1865, just various ways in which people marked emancipation. And when I asked who's celebrating emancipation, one of the things that is pretty clear is that it's almost always African Americans. So even though the end of slavery is an enormous deal. Very few whites are celebrating emancipation, and that's just something we can think about. This is a great parade image from Richmond, Virginia in the early 1900s. So you see, by this time, there were more African Americans who could take parts in the streets. This is the Thanksgiving festival that I showed earlier about the parade, so there were a lot of parades, there were church services and speeches. And I think one of the big things that separates our 19th century forebears from us is that they love listening to speeches. When you read transcripts of speeches, you'll hear applauses, laughters, boos, hisses. People are really into listening into speeches, and that's a big part of the emancipation celebrations. Frederick Douglass gave utterly remarkable man, gave a series of Emancipation Day speeches in Washington, D.C. for, I think, almost 15 years that he was invited. And a lot of times it was almost like the state of America. So some of those that I've read, he'd talk about lynching and talk about why this is against the spirit of emancipation. He'd talk about women's rights. In this one, he's talking about that freedom is still not quite there. When he ends like, how stands the Negro today? So very, very interesting, very complicated speeches. This is just a set of images from newspapers in the West, because we're interested in the West, that show how emancipation holidays on various days were something that were happening all over. So the Broad Axe in Utah, the Albuquerque paper in New Mexico Territory then, and Aspen, Colorado's Daily Chronicle. And you can see from the dates that the first two are probably related to the August 1st celebrations, and the second one to the September 22nd celebrations. I came across one paper in Colorado that said, we used to celebrate in January 1st, but it's too snowy, so we're gonna move our celebration to September. This one's from Richmond, Indiana. And basically, it's saying we are going to have a August 1st celebration. There's going to be a big picnic in Richmond. This one is from the Indianapolis Recorder, and they're looking at Shelbyville and Terre Haute, talking about emancipation celebrations in September, marking September 22nd in those cities. And much later, you see that emancipation is still being used as a way to commemorate African American freedom. After Brown v. Board, 1954, an important Supreme Court ruling, in Virginia, there were many schools that white school boards shut down schools instead of allowing African Americans to come. This is called massive resistance. So the Massive Resistance Campaign, there are generations of people in their 60s and 70s who missed huge chunks of their school years because of massive resistance. And this is an Emancipation Day flyer that was from the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that Martin Luther King and others organized. Reverend Wyatt Walker organized an Emancipation Day march onto the Capitol in Richmond, saying that Brown v. Board has to be enforced. Education is part of emancipation. Didn't go anywhere, but it shows how emancipation continued to be used. And this is our representative in the Indianapolis Recorder in 2011, and the article is just basically saying is that there's going to be a big Emancipation Day celebration on January 1st in several Indianapolis churches. So it's a holiday that is not a public holiday, but is still marked in various ways. But I also want to leave you with a question. We do have an official holiday called Freedom Day. That is February 1st. First one was 1949. The gentleman on the left is he was born into slavery in Georgia, and he came to Philadelphia. He was an educator, he was a banker, kind of an extraordinary man. His name was Richard Robert Wright Sr., and he lobbied first Philadelphia and then nationally that February 1st should be considered to be a federal holiday. It should be marked as a federal holiday. Philadelphia embraced it. Eventually, what you see is Harry S. Truman signing that in. So it wasn't going to be a day, it was a federal holiday, but not a day off. Okay, so it was a day to mark that Truman said that all Americans should mark the end of slavery and the beginning of freedom as a really important thing for America. It wasn't a black thing, it wasn't a white thing, it wasn't a brown thing, it was an American thing. Also, the United States was embarking on the beginning of the Cold War, had just fought against fascists in Europe, and against the Imperial Japan. So freedom was an idea that people could celebrate. What I have in clip there is also something from Barack Obama. President Obama did declare February 1st, 2015, Freedom Day. I don't recall anybody else marking this, but this was a day that under President Obama's, that's just an excerpt, is that we should celebrate freedom and dedicate ourselves to banning human trafficking and other forms of slavery that exist today. And next month is Freedom and Anti-Slavery Month in the United States. So be forewarned. So I just want to conclude with these images, partly because I love these posters. The stamp is below there. That was a stamp that was for the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. But these old-time posters are just, they're just beautiful, I think. But just kind of keep in mind, as we hear from Ms. Williams, what is emancipation? Who celebrates it? How do we commemorate it? And why and how? Thank you very much.